Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our forum for caregivers. My name is Sheila Neuberger, and I am the board chair of the National Council of Jewish Women, Toronto section. National Council of Jewish Women is delighted to have the opportunity to join our partners, Lifeline, UJA, Wellspring, the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, the Azrieli Foundation, and National Council's own L'Chaim program to present this informative and hopefully supportive forum this evening. National Council has a 125-year history of providing leadership on relevant social issues, and our content tonight certainly embraces a topic that impacts so many of us in both our professional and personal lives. We're fortunate to have been able to gather such an impressive panel, and I am pleased to turn the evening over to our moderator, Liv Mendelsohn, who's the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence. Over the course of her career, Liv has founded and helmed several organizations in the disability and caregiving space, including the Wagner Green Centre for Accessibility and Inclusion and the Real Abilities Toronto Film Festival. Liv serves as the chair of the City of Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee. She received the City of Toronto Equity Awareness and has been recognized by University College, University of Toronto, and the JCCA for her leadership. She's a senior fellow at Massey College and a graduate of the Mandel Institute for Nonprofit Leadership and Civic Leadership Foundation Diversity Fellowship Program. Welcome to everyone, and I'll hand it over to your capable hands, Liv.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila, and thank you for everyone who has come out on a night of an important Leafs game. We know how important caregiving is to you. We have assembled a wonderful panel, and I will introduce them each in turn as we bring them up. And also let them tell you a little bit about themselves. I'm here on behalf of the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence, and how many of you have heard of the Centre? Okay, some. We are relatively new. We are an initiative of the Azrieli Foundation, which probably more of you are familiar with, and we launched almost a year ago in May, and the process towards creating a center, I get asked several times a day, every day, why caregiving and why a center? And I think there's been recognition, both before the pandemic, but certainly because of what happened to caregivers during the pandemic, that this is a top of mind issue, both in the Jewish community and in the broader community, and that caregivers need more support. And we're going to talk a little bit about that through policy, through services. So I think this evening we're going to talk about caregiver needs, and each of the panelists is going to share some really empowering strategies and supports. My role is to give you a little bit of information about the 8 million caregivers in Canada and to share with you what the Centre is doing. So if you're a caregiver in the room, you are not alone. 1 in 4 Canadians is a caregiver today, and within 5 years, 1 in 2 Canadians will be a caregiver. So this is not an issue that is a niche issue. This is an issue for all Canadian families. I am a caregiver. I was born into a caregiving role. So when I was born, my booby lived with us, and she was an integral part of our family. She did lots of childcare. She picked us up from school and cared for us. And as she grew older and developed dementia, we learned as young teens to care for her. And that was normal and a natural part of our family. I'm a parent to a kid with a disability, and I am a daughter of a dad who now needs care and support himself. So this is not new in our community. This is not an issue that should be unfamiliar to anyone, but I think the policy focus on caregiving is something that has really been lacking and something that we're really hoping to advocate around. So I'm not going to bore you with a million statistics, but just so you know, I think one of the statistics that is really powerful is that for every 3 hours of care in the medical system, I have that backwards, for every hour of care in the medical system, caregivers are providing 3 hours of care at home. And what are we doing? Well, certainly we're providing care, emotional support, driving people to appointments, helping with feeding, helping with acts of daily living. But we also know that one of the things that we're doing is an enormous amount of paperwork and systems navigation. And we know that in some cases, caregivers are actually spending more time on systems navigation than we are with the person in our life who we love and care for. And that, I think, is a profoundly problematic statement about our health and social care systems right now. And I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room that without support, when the caregiver is suffering, the person who needs care is also suffering. In medical terms, when the caregiver is not well, the patient is not well. And at the bottom, loss of income, relentless demands, insufficient respite, danger of burnout, and stress-related illnesses are really, really a risk area for caregivers. We also know that caregivers, there are many young caregivers. There are also many older caregivers. A lot of caregivers themselves need care, and care is reciprocal in many ways. So many people are both giving and receiving care, and I think that's important to note. We also want to share a little bit of information about care providers. So the people who are paid, for whom it is their vocation to look after someone. So that's personal support workers, home health care aides, disability service providers. We need to do better for these people so that they can continue to support us and our families. And we know that there's really high turnover. There's a tremendous workforce shortage across the country now. These jobs don't pay as well as they should. They are undervalued, and they are largely newcomer racialized women doing this work. So I think looking at both sides of the equation when it comes to caregiving is critical. We need both family caregivers, chosen family neighbors, and we need the people who choose to work as care providers to be well supported. So quickly about us. As I said, this predates the pandemic, and there were a couple of years of consultations to see how the foundation could best support families and caregivers. I know some of you on the panel and some of you in the room, indeed, were part of those consultations. And one of the things that emerged, as I said, was the need to look at both caregivers and care providers, not to only look at one side of the coin, but also for the first time for the foundation to take a role in policy and advocacy. The foundation is nonpartisan and has never done advocacy work before, but on this issue, we recognize, yes, we can have a role in providing some services, and I'll talk about that. And yes, we can convene, but one of the biggest pieces of work that needs to happen is advocacy. And I think actually Dr. Stahl was a big proponent of that during the consultation period. So hats off to Nathan. So where are we now? Our mission really is to support and empower caregivers and care providers to advance the knowledge and capacity of the field and to advocate for effective and visionary social policy. So I don't want to bore you, but I will share with you that we are very active. We're funding many, many projects across the country in education and leadership development, both for caregivers and care providers, in support networks and knowledge sharing, advocacy and policy development, and inclusion in underserved communities. And we hear from both caregivers and care providers that they are constantly told, both during the pandemic and beyond, to be resilient. You must be resilient. You must engage in self-care. And that's important, but we need to be supported to be resilient, and we need to have community care to have healthcare. And so tonight we're going to be sharing some strategies, but we also know that everything you learn here tonight and engage in here tonight has to be supported with services and supports. That taking a bubble bath alone, while it can be helpful, is not alone going to solve issues around burnout and respite. And I want to be really clear on that. And one of the things that we've done while we fight for a better tomorrow in caregiving is to partner with CAMH to offer ACT therapy, to offer mindfulness, to offer ongoing supports for caregivers. So those are all free and available. And what is muffin rage? It's sort of, again, the other side of the coin. A doctor and care provider wrote a great article in the LA Times where she said, if I get one more basket of muffins during the pandemic, I'm going to throw the muffins back, because care providers also don't want muffins. They want better policy and supports. And that is something that I think is important to recognize. So one of the things we did this year was launch our policy white paper. And some of the things that it speaks about are the need for coordination in caregiving, creating federal and provincial legislation, developing strategies to support caregivers who are working so that they can take leaves, so that that they're not penalized for taking time out of their career to engage in caregiving. They don't lose out on CPP and pension and all of that. Income supports for caregivers, developing the care workforce. There are lots and lots of things that we can do together. And I think you're going to hear from all of our panelists in different ways about some empowering tools that you can take home today. And one of the other things you can do today is join our Caregivers Advisory Network, which has a core group of about 30 caregivers. Donna is one of them, who are involved in helping us prioritize in terms of advocacy, but also has thousands and thousands of caregivers who are ready to call their MP, write their MPP or their MLA, and talk about the need for policy supports. And one of the next things that we're going to do together is have a summit in November in Ottawa, a national caregiving summit focused on the needs of caregivers and care providers. So you can go to our website to look at all the different projects and programs that we're funding. But in terms of immediate support and help for you today, we have some online support, but also you're going to hear directly. And that's why I love this panel, because everyone on this panel is going to share ideas and tools to help you right now while you work for us, to wait for us and work with us to try to change the policy landscape together. So that's, I think, enough for me. I hope that sets the stage a little bit about the crisis in care that we're in right now, and we can speak more about that in the Q&A. We have some super able panelists, really visionary leaders, each in their own way. I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we're going to start with Donna Thomson. So I'll start by introducing Donna, which is an absolute pleasure. Donna literally has written the book or books on caregiving. She's been involved in care in a long time, both as a parent to a kid with medical complexity, who is now a thriving adult with medical complexity, largely due to Donna's tremendous advocacy. And Donna also cared for a parent with dementia. So she's really seen both the disability and aging sides of caregiving. She wrote The Unexpected Journey of Caregiving, The Transformation of Loved One to Caregiver, which is a must read, and a more personal, The Four Walls of My Freedom, Lessons I've Learned from a Life of Caregiving. She also is very involved in making sure that the perspectives and understanding and expertise of caregivers is involved and embedded from the start in research. That we're not doing research on people, but with people and for people together. And also, Donna helped design and teaches a Caregiver Essentials course at McMaster, which if you are currently in a caregiving journey, I can't recommend enough, and I hope she'll speak a little bit more about that. And she's the past vice chair of Kids Brain Health Network and currently sits on the board of the National Access Arts Center, which is a fabulous organization trying to make the arts more inclusive in Canada. And they have a new gallery space in Toronto, which you should definitely check out. So welcome to Donna. I believe Naomi will be speaking after Donna. Am I right about that? No, Nathan? Okay. So Dr. Nathan Stahl is a geriatrician and clinician scientist at Mount Sinai and at Women's College as well, and an assistant professor at the Department of Medicine at U of T. And really, he has been a powerhouse researcher and a powerhouse in the area of advocacy. Not all doctors get involved in policy. I think Dr. Stahl is a giant in policy in Canada, and we're very lucky that care for patients, care for individual patients has inspired and motivated him to look at health systems and to be involved in the Institute of Health Policy. He was the Assistant Scientific Director of Ontario's Science Advisory Table, which was quite a role. And you may remember his advocacy from that period, which saved many, many lives in the province. So we're very grateful to Nathan for his continuing work, tireless work. And Dr. Naomi Gryfe, Saperia, I'm going to say it for me, Saperia. I keep wanting to say Saperia and give you some flair, but it's Saperia. Is a clinical and health psychologist in Ontario who works both in hospitals and in private practice, working with families and caregivers who are dealing with illness and disability. She has also a tremendous research track record and is known for her sensitivity to caregivers, and as a caregiver herself, really understands, I think, that relationship. So her current clinical practice focuses on the mental health and well-being of those caring for a loved one with an illness or disability. So we're grateful to have you here today. So, quick round of applause for our panelists. And I'm going to turn it over to Donna to get us started.
Thank you so much, Liv. So I just want to begin by talking about positioning the beginning of this conversation this evening with family. And, you know, as Liv said, care is reciprocal, care is developmental. We begin as caregivers in a reactive way. Someone in our family, someone we love needs us. So we begin to react to that need out of love and necessity. So, you know, the example that I think of is if my mother said, "I'm thirsty," I would give her a drink and say, "I'll have mine later." But over time, having your drink of water or your cup of tea later becomes habit. And if you try to backtrack and give yourself that drink of water or tea, you feel guilty about it. So there is a dynamic here I want to talk about at the micro level of love and family. Next slide. So this is my family. On the left is my dad, whom I adored. He was a Second World War decorated war hero. And in 1973, he had the first of 3 strokes and lived with us at home. He lost his mobility and his speech. And he died in 1975, and I think of him every day. This is my mother sitting on the left, our son Nicholas, and my husband behind my mother, and all of my sister who helped me. You know, we cared for our mom together. This is family. These 2 images, I think, represent a lifetime of family caregiving for me. Next slide. So the first tool, I really want to talk tonight about some very fundamental, basic, helpful tools to help you pour a cup of tea at the same time as you're pouring a cup of tea for somebody else in your family. So this is called the F words for living. It originates in the world of childhood disability. Its science is it's very evidence-based. This F words template was developed at the Child Research Institute for Childhood Disability at McMaster, but the science is rooted at the WHO. And really, you can go to this website, print off this piece of paper. Everybody in the family gets to fill it out. What is important to you in the next week, if things are changing very quickly on the care front, or month or year, in these F-word domains of function, family, fitness, fun, friends, and future. So if I were to fill this out, and I have, for fitness, I would say I need 1 walk a day, and once a week I need to play tennis. That's my minimum for fitness that I need to be healthy and kind of happy in my head that I've moved my body. So everybody in the family can fill this out, put it on the table, and then ask yourself, who's going to help each other reach your F-word goals? Next slide. Another really illuminating tool is a care map. So a care map is a visual aid. This is mine, so you can tell you need no artistic skills to do this, evidently. But I learned a lot from doing my care map. All the instructions are at this website, and it's called atlasofcaregiving.com. Again, very evidence-based. The guy who created Atlas Care Maps is a former NASA scientist who became a family caregiver and developed this method of visualizing your life and drawing it with pencil and paper of who is in your ecosystem of care. But that's not all. He then created a set of prompt questions to ask yourself and to share with your social worker or family, whoever you want. Next slide. So these are some sample reflection questions that will help you figure out what are the gaps in your ecosystem of care, what are the strengths, and what are some possibilities that maybe you hadn't seen before. So next slide. So the other thing is just asking for help. It's a huge issue for caregivers. It's so hard to ask for help. So I thought I often tell caregivers, or I suggest, the rule of threes. So coming from the asset-based community development movement, we know there are things in our lives that we can easily do by ourselves, some that we need some help with, and some things we can't or don't want to do at all. We want somebody else to do them. So thinking along those lines, pick 3 tasks you would like to download, whether you want something else, a little help with that, or you want somebody else to do them. And then match 3 people or providers to help with these tasks. So I did this. Next slide. And that's my drawing. So I needed more home care for my mom. Where am I going to get it? So I kind of had a brainstorm with my sister about where could we go to possibly find some resources to add more home care. We needed yard work done for my mother. So we decided to phone the local high school, community center, and church. Same for dog walking. So the rule of 3. Next slide. And finally, there are lots of sites out there that are really helpful in helping families create a network of support. So not social network, care network, where you bring together anyone who ever said, is there anything I can do? And so putting them in a closed online network site that is highly secure, there are several of these out there. Well, there are lots of them, actually. This is the one that we use for our son, Nicholas, and all his paid caregiver and family members are there together. So it's got his medication list and ICU do's and don'ts, but it also has his Christmas list, wish list. So it's his life. He lives with medical complexity, so we needed some way to coordinate that. There will be, I think, some resources that are going to be emailed after this event.
Yes, thank you for
So you'll have all of these, the links and so forth for this in an email later on. And yes, the course. So the Caregivers Essential course through McMaster Continuing Education is a course that I facilitate. And it's a great primer for family caregiving. It has all the big aspects of the challenges that you'll face. Fundamentally, we shouldn't have to just learn the hard way through our mistakes. I'm a huge believer in training, and there are tools in that course such as the Caregiver Action Plan, which is actually a nursing tool that is just given to caregivers. Here's how not to have a nightmare. You know, you won't have your health card, you don't have the list of medications in the emergency room. These tools save so much grief along those lines. So I urge you to just check out the website, and we do monthly free webinars. Liv has been a guest, and now I'm going to get you guys to come on the webinar too, but we always have really interesting conversations. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Donna.
I'm a little bit taller. I'll fix it for you, Naomi. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Nathan Stahl. I'm a geriatrician at Mount Sinai Hospital, and I'm also a researcher. Thanks so much for hosting this amazing event. I know there were a lot of organizations involved. Thank you to Liv for giving such a good background of setting the sort of landscape of caregiving really in Canada. And thank you as well to Donna and to Naomi. I don't have the lived experience that you have, and so I'm really grateful for sharing your personal stories, for opening up and showing family photos, and for really connecting with people on such a personal level. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the sort of clinical aspects in terms of navigating the healthcare system. So I work at Mount Sinai in a number of roles. I work on the internal medicine units at Mount Sinai Hospital. I also consult to frail older adults who end up on different services and may run into issues. And then I have a geriatric medicine clinic. And through all of those, I interact with caregivers on a very frequent basis. And of course, I research caregiving. So I think one of the fundamental things, Donna has given some very practical tips about how to approach caregiving, some very fundamental tools. One of the things that I notice, and we are very guilty of healthcare professionals, is there is a real disconnect between what the provider thinks about or thinks they know about the caregiver and what the caregiver actually needs and desires. So what do I mean by that? If I'm a healthcare provider in a system, we don't actually in our electronic medical records overwhelmingly identify who the caregiver actually is. So if I'm at Mount Sinai Hospital, as I was today, and I pull up the record, there's an emergency contact. The emergency contact is an individual's name and number that was listed at one healthcare encounter and often stays for a long period of time. There's often an assumption that that person is the caregiver. There's often an assumption that there's one caregiver, and often that's not true at all. So even fundamentally from the moment that a patient walks through the door, there is a real missed opportunity to identify that caregiver. And I think that's symbolic, as I'll talk about, of the fact that we largely exclude caregivers. I'm going to give some positive examples too. It's not all doom and gloom, but that caregivers are not fully integrated into the healthcare team in the way that they ought to be. So that's like one practical piece of information about who we often assume is the caregiver and the lack of ability to identify them. Similarly, we often assume that the people at the bedside are the caregiver. The person at the bedside who is visiting the individual may be there for a social visit. They may not be the caregiver. And often that individual, if there's somebody at the bedside, is provided with the information for discharge instructions, provided with critical health information, and they're not actually the person who's going to need to implement that and know that fully. So those are two sort of fundamental, missed opportunities, I would call them, for caregivers to really connect with the healthcare team. We also know that healthcare providers, and there's research on this, feel that they have involved caregivers and educated them and supported them much more than we actually do. It's true, there's good research to support this. So if you survey the dyad of the healthcare provider and the caregiver, we often feel that we're doing a much better job than we actually are. So what are the unmet needs of caregivers? It depends on the setting and the inpatient setting, the community setting, but there are several fundamental unmet needs that are recurring themes for caregivers in healthcare settings. One is simply lack of information. So, the hospital environment in particular is a threatening, overwhelming environment. Finding the doctor is often like finding Pokeroo. And on the flip side, what will often happen to me when I'm there is I have 25 or 30 patients who are under my care. I'm responsible for overseeing the trainees that I have, the residents, the medical students. And at some point, we'll get a notification that someone has come and they want information. And this is sort of competing with all the other tasks in the day. But on the other side, the caregiver doesn't know what we are actually facing. And so there's a real inability to actually, at times, find time to have that interaction with the caregiver, because sometimes it's actually physically impossible. And from the caregiver's perspective, they can't be waiting my entire workday for me to show up, which is sometimes the unfortunate reality that exists. So there are opportunities I've started, it's not uniform, but to leverage, here's a technology example. And I don't know why we have such aversion to actually emailing with family members and actually, many of my colleagues don't do this. Usually when I'm on service, I give patients my phone number, just because it's absolutely impossible to usually come at the moment that somebody wants to talk. And I will often call people on my way home from work. But I think that there are opportunities to actually use different forms of communication than waiting for the healthcare provider to come by. Similarly, so there's a lack of information problem. There's a lack of skills, knowledge, and training problem. So a lot happens in a healthcare encounter. A lot of instructions are given. Often, especially if somebody's hospitalized, medications have changed. There may be home care that's activated. There may be devices that need to be used. There are follow-up appointments. This spans the home care system, the hospital system, sometimes the rehab system, at times the long-term care system. And there is just, simply not enough dedicated time given. In fact, there's a lot of time where it never happens at all to actually counsel the caregiver who's going to be responsible for implementing most of these recommendations and advice. So Liv talked about how 75% of all home and community care in our country is provided unpaid by individuals. And not only are they, this is another common misconception, not only are they providing care, but they're doing tasks that are complex and intense that are similar to tasks that were done in the hospital by regulated healthcare professionals. So we're asking people to take on these complex and intense tasks. We're not necessarily providing them with the supports, education, and training they need. And then there's often not a place for people to turn when things go wrong, other than ending up in our acute care department and repeating the entire cycle of care again. So there are things that have evolved to try and help people, but we're still not there yet in terms of integrating the caregiver into the circle of care, especially around transitions of care, to make sure that they have that skills, knowledge, and training, and the ability, and also somewhere to follow up when they need support. Donna talked a lot about self-care, and yes, there's the muffin rage. Yoga is another famously used one that is often offered to healthcare providers, sometimes to caregivers as well. But there is actually a science and a clinical science to assessing caregivers' needs. And that is not taught in many, if not all, health disciplines. Certainly, I was never taught that in medical school or in my residency training. There are standardized tools to evaluate caregiver needs. There are standardized assessments. The challenge is, in today's healthcare environment, we often don't have time to fully assess the patient, let alone the caregiver, right? So there are these competing needs, but the caregiver not only is excluded from often the decision-making and the education and support about the patient, their actual needs, which are distinct from their care recipient, are not usually assessed at all. And if they're assessed, it's usually around the sort of distress piece, go take care of yourself, be resilient, as opposed to, you need education perhaps about diabetes and how to monitor the blood glucose and who to call. We can refer you to this pathway. So it's not just the stress and distress piece, it's the skills that they may need to take on, it's the knowledge that they may need. And it's also options, as Liv talked about, for respite for the person that they're caring for, because someone can't continue to do this job 24/7, 365 without a break. I get to go home at the end of the day. There's somebody in the hospital now who looks after the patients. But for caregivers, it's 24/7, 365. So, what are the practical things that emerge out of that? I think, so there are things that you can advocate for yourself in terms of identifying who the caregiver is, but I think we need to do a better job of that. So at Sinai, a lot of this has been disrupted by the pandemic, sadly, but we actually at the Bridgepoint campus developed caregiver badges. So this was actually, in the same way that I wear a badge in the hospital, this was identifying that this was the caregiver. That person, I don't want to talk about visitor hours, but they were actually exempt from the visiting hours of the hospital, but it allowed people to understand who this person was. And I think that's actually quite an important innovation that's extraordinarily simple. But just be aware that the healthcare team often doesn't know who the caregiver, who the multiple caregivers are, and they will speak to the first available person or the first phone number that they can find in the chart. Full stop. The other thing is transitions of care or changes to somebody's care are a very vulnerable time for the care recipient. Leaving hospital, big changes to home care, big changes to medication management. These are times at risk for the care recipient. We have good data that discharge is a risky time for people from hospital. The ability and the need to involve caregivers in that care transition process is so incredibly important. And so, again, it's unfair because the onus is placed on the caregiver to find their way to when that opportunity might be. We have discharge times written on the hospital walls. We almost never observe them. But the need to really advocate from the beginning of the hospitalization that I am the caregiver. I'm going to need to understand what medication changes there are. I'm going to need to understand what the change to the care plan is. And I need to be there when you're providing the discharge papers and the discharge instructions. Can often save people a lot of headache, hassle, and often readmission or need to seek out additional care for the care recipient. The additional thing that I think healthcare systems need to do a much better job, in addition to identifying who the caregiver is, assessing their needs, is we do a very poor job of, I would say, just like physically accommodating the caregiver. So where does the caregiver actually stay in the hospital, in the clinic, in the long-term care home? There's often no space for them. And not only is there no physical space, so they're lucky if they can get a chair, many of caregivers are working. Where can they actually go to take a meeting or to take a call or to take care of their basic needs? So some hospitals, I'm not aware of, Liv can correct, I'm not aware of any in Canada, but some have actually developed dedicated caregiver resource centers.
There's a couple in Alberta.
In Alberta, okay, good.
But none in Ontario.
Not in Ontario. And this is a place where not only can they have a workstation or somewhere to sit down, a lot of them also use the opportunities to have health librarians or individuals that can help counsel and educate the caregivers. But it's really sad to see, the types of spaces that caregivers have to try and occupy, in a very busy place. I think overall, I could talk, we could all talk for hours, I'm sure, on this topic. One of the things that I'm grateful for is events like this, centers like the Canadian Caregiver Center for Excellence, individuals like Donna and Naomi and Liv. I have started to see a change in terms of increased recognition of caregiving, which is the first step in all of this. And there is really, I think there's an accelerating movement to recognizing that this is an issue. You only have to look across this room to note that probably 85% of people here are women. I don't think it can be ignored that caregiving is largely, though it shouldn't be, a women's issue, and I happen to think that's probably why it's been ignored for so long. That caregiving is felt to be the natural work of women when it was child rearing, whether it's now caregiving. There's many ways which we socialize throughout society to think about women as the natural caregivers and men as the unnatural caregivers. That's both unfair to women, But it's also unfair to men in that they, the increasing number of men who are taking on these roles are often viewed as sort of inauthentic caregivers as well. So extra kudos from my perspective to the men who have come out tonight for this event. But I think that's an important issue, that caregiving is really a feminist issue, that we can't ignore that in the context of other sort of social justice movements, that we need to recognize the disproportionate burden that is placed on women, the disproportionate impact that is had on women because of caregiving, and to recognize that as we try and work on these other social justice movements, that this is a social justice movement that requires the same sort of dedication, efforts, and fervor that other movements have taken on in recent years. So I am hopeful, but there still is a need fundamentally to make people aware of the incredible work and role that caregivers assume. And that, I think, will have downstream effects in the healthcare system to better integrate caregivers and support them. So I will hand it over to Naomi now.
He'd fix the mic for me. It's okay, I'll take it. It's all right. No. I'll take it.
You sure?
Yeah.
You're all over for you.
Yeah. You are a giant in our field.
Yeah.
In many ways. Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for having me. I know I'm the last one of the evening, so thank you for your attention. I want to thank all of these panelists who I think I'm so fortunate to be considered among them, because they've all been so prominent and in their fields, and I really appreciate all of you so much. And I think that, Nathan's talk, he did such a good job of explaining, as we all know, that caregiving is so difficult, and the system that we find ourselves in really makes those challenges even greater. So he sort of provided us with, why nights like tonight are so important, where we can gather and gain support. And Donna's practical tips, I think, are so incredibly valuable, and hopefully got you thinking about things like self-care and boundaries and what you need to put in place in your own lives so that your caregiving journey is made a little bit easier. And so I guess what's left for me to talk about, but I think if you have the why and you have the how, what's actually left for me is to just tell you that you can do it. And how do I know that to be true? Well, you don't have to take my word for it. Actually, there's decades of psychological research that suggests that, it looks at how we grow and how we thrive, and actually has found that, although this is maybe a taboo word for this evening in the end, that humans have the capacity to be resilient. And even if you don't feel that way, we all have that in us. We have the power to overcome adversity. That's what I mean by resilient. And if we cannot change the situation that we actually find ourselves in, we all have the capacity to manage that. We just have to be able to muster it, right? So I'm sure that many of you have heard this word, caregiver resilience, and to be resilient. And I think what people mean by that often when we hear it sort of generally is that we have the ability to bounce back. But I think there's a misconception when it comes to resilience. And a lot of people think that people are either born to be resilient or they aren't. But that's not true. Resilience is it's a process. It's not an outcome, right? It's actually an active engagement on our part to change the way we perceive threat, right? To focus our attention instead away from that threat to actually seeing sort of our strengths and our value. And I'm here to tell you tonight that you can actually do that there are skills and strategies to do it. Now, it's not easy. Okay, so I don't want for a second anyone to think, I don't want to be one of those people who says, just be resilient, caregivers, oh God. How many times did I hear that as a caregiver too, right? That's not what I mean by this at all. Caregiving is so hard. So acknowledge that for yourselves first and foremost, okay? I know that from my own personal experiences. I know that from the clients I see, and I know that from the research. Caregiving comes with stress. Caregiving comes with feelings of sadness and loss and guilt and isolation and even feeling very overwhelmed. So if any of you are feeling that in the crowd right now, you should know that you are not alone in feeling that at all, okay? And having all of those feelings, well, actually, that's okay. Those are normal and even adaptive. And identifying the fact that you have them is actually the first step in improving that process of resilience. So why is that the case? Well, first of all, it's important to allow yourself to feel those feelings, okay? So whatever it is that you may be feeling, allow yourself that self-compassion and that space to feel it. But also to know that having those negative feelings or being in that place can sometimes cloud our thinking, right? It makes thinking less clear. You don't have to be a caregiver to know that when you are stressed, you may not be making your best decisions, right? So it can be difficult to think clearly, and there's actually a physiological reason for that. So you see, our stress response is actually amazing. It's actually our body's way of protecting us from danger. So it protects us from a threat. So if you think about like our ancestors, right? If you were a cave person and you left your cave and there was a tiger in your path, right? Our stress response kicks in to get us out of that threat, gets us out of the way. If you adapt that to today and you're crossing Bathurst Street, right? Or you're trying to get through the construction at Shepherd that I sat in for 20 minutes, if there's a car zooming towards you, you need to get out of the way, right? You need to be able to run. So the stress response, some people know it as flight or fight, if you've ever heard of that, actually kicks in to cause the physiology in your body to start releasing all kinds of things to make sure that you can get out of the way. Here's the thing, it's automatic. It's quick, right? You don't see it coming, and that's adaptive because you need to get out of the way. But those same hormones, those same chemicals that cause you to your heart to race fast, the oxygen to go to your blood, the muscles to get ready to run, right, also have an impact on your mind. And in the same way that you don't want to be thinking, well, if I run to the right, it's going to cost, it might be 4 seconds. If I run to the left, it might be 6. You just want to get out of the way. There is no room for creative thinking in your flight or fight response. Your thinking becomes inflexible, it becomes rigid, right? And there's no room for creativity, there's no room for shades of gray. So when you're under stress, it is actually quite natural for you not to see these opportunities, to feel your strength, to know your power, and just to kind of focus on that threat. But once we recognize that that is what's happening, we can actually start to shift our attention away from threat to our strengths. And that is the process of being resilient, of growing in your caregiving role. So, research actually suggests that if you can focus on your strengths, if you can move that perception, you get an increase in mood, you get an increase in confidence, you get an increase in your self-esteem, in happiness, and it even increases our capacity to manage that stress. Okay, so how do we do it, right? I'm saying this to you, and I'm recognizing that this is probably going to sound easier said than done, but I do want to offer you some practical strategies. And those practical strategies come in the form of 3 questions that you can ask yourself. So if you take anything from my talk this evening, try to remember these. These are the questions that you can ask yourself to start shifting yourself away from being in that highly stressful mode that exhausts you, right? Because actually, what I forgot to say is that our stress response, as amazing as it is, cannot tell the difference between the threat of a tiger, a car, or what we face as caregivers. The decisions, the advocacy, the responsibility, that same stress response is going to fire no matter what the threat is. And because we face these over and over and over again, it's exhausting, right? That stress response doesn't know to shut down. So here are 3 questions you can ask yourself to try to get yourself out of that situation, and let's start moving towards looking at it from a strength perspective instead. So strategy in question 1. Maybe some of you already do this, where you sort of, at the end of each day, you write down 3 things you're grateful for. This is a big thing, to be grateful, and I think that's an amazing skill. It's an amazing thing to do. But what I would say is take that one step further. But I want you to ask yourself, what are 3 things I did well today? Because actually, if you think about gratitude, it's passive, right? We are thankful for the things that we have received, and that's great. Important to recognize. But when you say, what are 3 things I did well, that's active. I am contributing, right? I am doing something here. that gives me more confidence, right? And that actually makes me feel like, yes, I can do it, which is the message I want you to leave here with tonight. The second question you can ask yourself is, it's very hard to see your strengths and to sort of identify what brings you joy when you're in this stressful state. So the question to ask yourself is, what energizes me? Okay, these are things that come naturally to you. These are things that you could probably do for hours without noticing the passage of time, right? These are things that maybe you did before you were a caregiver, right? That you've kind of put to the side. What is something that energizes me? And the reason you ask yourself that question is because once you can identify something that brings you strength, that brings you joy, you can weave it into your caregiving experience so that those tasks don't feel as draining. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'm mindful of the time. But in my caregiving journey, I would often find myself, and I think it was one of probably the most stressful places in the entire world, and that is a pediatric ICU. And as I used to sit by my daughter's bedside while on life support, there was another little child right next to me, and her father would come in every night with his guitar, and he would play lullabies every night. And when I spoke to him about it, he said, well, I'm a musician. What brings me joy is music. This place is too stressful. I can't handle it. And so I play the music to calm me down and to connect with my child. Another parent told me once that she found those hospital rooms so suffocating. The air, stale, it's hard to be in there. And so she would come and take her daughter out to just outside the hospital. Couldn't walk very far, but just outside the hospital to breathe the fresh air. And then that parent told me that way, when she came back, she could actually be calmer. She was more compassionate. She was kinder, right? She was able to incorporate sort of her joy and what brought her joy into her caregiving experience to make her a better caregiver, which ultimately for many of us is our goal. Maybe a last example was another parent who told me that one of the hardest parts about being a caregiver for her was that she was always the one to give. And as she became a caregiver, she realized, well, she's going to have to start receiving some help. And it was really hard for her to sort of take that in and switch that role. And she said she met another person in the hospital whose child was going to be there for their birthday. And that mom was really upset. How could they spend their first birthday in hospital? And so this other mom said, well, you know what I'll do? Despite my horrible sleep deprivation, she stayed up until halfway through the night with those nurses and decorated the entire hall of that hospital to ensure that when that mom came in the next morning, that child was going to have a birthday party. And what she told me was the next day you would think she'd be so tired. She's already sleep deprived. But actually, she was able to feel that need. She was able to feel what energized her, which was to give. And that can be anything for any of you. But the point is to find that strength, find that joy, and use it. Use it in your caregiving experience. So ask yourself, what energizes me? What brings me joy? Because it's going to make me a better caregiver. Not because it's selfish, but because it's going to make me a better caregiver. And lastly, the third question to increase resilience. Sorry. Okay. Is a reminder, we have this, it's a funny thing about being human. We actually are much kinder to others than we are to ourselves, right? This thing of self-compassion, oh man, hard for anybody and incredibly hard for caregivers. So the third question I would encourage you to ask yourself, if you are struggling to find the strength, right, is what would I tell my friend in this situation? Sounds awfully simple, but my guess is that you are going to be much kinder in that response than you are being to yourself. So if you can ask yourself those three questions, that will start to dampen that stress response. I cannot take away the stress of caregiving, right? That's part of the package. But sometimes when we can't change the situation we find ourselves in, we ask ourselves these questions to make it a little bit more manageable. And ultimately, I know my time is up and I did want to leave time for questions. I guess I just want to leave you with that I know there's so many unknowns in caregiving. And there's difficulty in the fact that we can't always anticipate what's coming. I think that's what often leads to a lot of the suffering, a lot of the questioning we do. It's the sort of that uncertainty of what's going to come. But what I know to be true, and what I will tell you to be true, is that each of you, even though I do not know you personally, each of you has the strength, has the capacity, has the skills within to weather whatever storm is going to come your way. I believe that to be true. I know that in stressful situations, it is hard to see that. So if you need help finding it, reach out to me, to any mental health care provider who you can access. We will help you find it, but know that you have it. And what I want to leave you with tonight is just, I send you strength in your journey, and I believe that you can. And I will turn it back to Liv.
That was wonderful, and I think we're on the same page about resilience.
Sorry for the
No,
term.
I
I'm going to think of a better word next time.
I think it's beautiful. I think asking yourself, what did I do well, can be life-changing. And I think the kind of training and education that Donna and Nathan are talking about is a little piece of what you just gave us. So really taking resilience from go take a bubble bath to here are some skills that you can use that are going to empower you